Live. 1 second for the pause. And we're live.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to today's open meeting of the NSB-NSF Commission on Merit Review. My name is Stephen Willard, Chair of the Commission, and I am accompanied by the Commission's Vice Chair, Wanda Ward. The Commission on Merit Review is comprised of members from the National Science Board and the National Science Foundation. Let's start by taking the roll. Roger Beachy.
Here.
Alicia Needler.
Here.
Steve Leith. Candace Major.
Here.
Matt Malkin.
Here.
Sarah K. McDonald.
Here.
Julia Phillips.
Here.
Scott Stanley.
Here.
Kayvon Stassen. And Wanda Ward.
Here.
Our NSBO liaisons are Portia Flowers, Ann Bushmiller, and Alexandra Serchel. And our consultant is Brad Gutierrez. We are also joined by Albert Einstein Distinguished Educator Fellow Michael Stewart and AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow Andrew Zeidel. Last month, we had a very productive conversation about additional review criteria. I appreciate Sarah Kay, Julia, and Alicia for helping us identify potential areas for further examination. I continue to be grateful for the NSF members of our commission and our NSF colleagues outside of the commission. Your knowledge and hard work keeping us informed is a valuable asset. Today, we turn our attention to criteria evaluation, which has been a long-standing topic of inquiry for NSF and the board through various merit review examinations. Through its 1996 discussion report, the NSB-NSF Staff Task Force on Merit Review asserted that, quote, maintaining flexibility in the application of criteria is as important as the criteria themselves. It also acknowledged the limitations of external expert reviewers and said that pre-assigned weighting of criteria could result in ineffective proposal assessments. Keep in mind, this was when the two criteria we have now were first established. Instead, it noted that the advisory role of external reviewers, as opposed to the decision-making role of program officers, and therefore recommended that, quote, NSF staff be provided flexibility and discretion in the application and weighting of criteria. The following year, after deliberating over several proposal evaluation options, the task force ultimately recommended the use of reviewer narrative commentary with a single combined rating of both criteria to provide program officers with more information to make their decisions, particularly for high-risk, high-reward proposals, while also linking proposal ratings with proposal decisions. The task force also acknowledged drawbacks to this approach, including the inherent subjectivity of narrative summaries, the difficulty of evaluating the effectiveness and fairness of the merit review system, and an implicit weighting of each criterion by reviewers, with greater attention given to intellectual merit over broader impact. Public comments to recommendations cited criteria weighting as a central issue, with many stating IM was more important than BI and the two should not be equally weighted. As a result, the task force determined that the criteria do not have to be equally weighted in reviewer ratings and should depend instead on NSF guidance and/or reviewer judgment of the relevant and relative importance of the criteria to the proposed work. Nearly 15 years later, a summary report of stakeholders' input for the 2011 NSB Task Force on Merit Review echoed similar yet nuanced concerns compared to those expressed by stakeholders in 1997. Most NSF staff, NSF advisory committee members, reviewers, and principal investigators believed that intellectual merit was weighted more than broader impact, and indeed found IM to be more important than BI. However, a larger proportion of NSF staff and advisory committee members compared to reviewers and PIs believed more equal weighting to be appropriate. Stakeholders requested clearer guidance regarding the relative weightings of IM and BI. As a result, the 2011 task force recommended, quote, both criteria are to be given full consideration during the review and decision-making processes. Each criterion is necessary, but neither by itself is sufficient. This specific language has been included in the proposal and award policies and procedures guide, what we call the PAP-G, ever since. To ensure IM and BI are addressed along the merit review process, the task force also recommended the implementation of 1, a separate section in the project description within the PAP-G that describes the broader impacts of the proposed activities. 2, project descriptions addressing both criteria in all decision documents produced by the NSF staff. 3, enforcement of the requirement that all public award abstracts describe how the project addresses both criteria. And 4, updates to annual and final project report templates to explicitly address progress in all activities of the project, including any activities intended to address the broader impacts criterion that are not intrinsic to the research. 12 years later, we see that many of these recommendations have been implemented, but questions about how both criteria are evaluated remain present. During this hour, I'd like us to consider how criteria are currently evaluated by reviewers and the extent to which they are taken into consideration in decision-making by NSF staff. I'd also like us to consider how NSF ensures the equal consideration of both criteria in reviews and decisions, and how this is done holistically. Continuing our practice of commission members, joining Wanda and me in guiding the conversation, today we will be asking Candace Major, Program Director in the Directorate for Geosciences, and National Science Board member Roger Beachy to lead our discussion. At this time, I'd like to turn to Roger to start us on what I anticipate will be a robust conversation.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate all the comments were made before, and for having put Ann and others, Portia, the information and diligent that provide a backdrop for this discussion today. Found them very useful, and I think the narrative that Steve just went through highlights the importance of this discussion. And ultimately, the question is there a change in policy that's necessary at the NSF that would address our concerns, if there are concerns, if those have changed? I want to also thank all of those in the NSF team that are here, because we will rely on you a lot to help us to understand how the process at the NSF has been handled, and whether or not any changes are necessary. As has been said in a previous Committee on Oversight and Commission on Merit Review meetings, there is currently no weighting of the criteria, no specified rating of the criteria for the reasons that were given in the reviews that were in 97 and 11, I guess, the ones that Steve read through. Instead, reviewers are instructed to give each criteria full consideration, which may be reviewed to as a holistic evaluation. So we'd like to take a little bit of time to understand from you all what this means to you. What does holistic evaluation mean? And how are we paying close attention to individual criteria, or is there a bigger role at play? Is it a bigger picture? And if that bigger picture is important to us, then what do we expect of reviewers and then those who are the program officers? How is this managed? And Candace and I have had discussions about this, and we're still confused. And I am. Candace is not, because she's the instructor. She helps to instruct some of the reviewing and has some input on the way policy is set at the NSF. So today I'd like to explore several questions, and I'd like to hear from those who have submitted applications. And Matt, that's you, and I guess Scott and others who have applied to the NSF for support. And then have some input from those from the NSF who have had experiences in managing these things. To you, what does holistic evaluation mean to you? And what are the gaps? What are the current gaps that you see in a holistic evaluation as we consider it? We've been considering individual criteria, IM and BI, but there's more than that. And program officers have the opportunity to help to shape the nature of portfolios and others. So, Matt, when you make an application, what do you expect of the reviewers will say, and how they'll review your proposals, rather, not how which will they weight, and how will they weight them, and are they important to you as a writer? So I hate to put you on this, don't mean to put you on the
That's
spot.
right. I mean, I feel like it's been changing. In years past, it was almost all the effort was on IM. And that's spent 90% of the time on the proposal, and also in the text of the proposal, thinking about it and so on. I've been thinking about and putting more into the proposals on broader impact. Now, some things that I never would have done before. In fact, talking to people at local schools and really coming up with something that I think would be valuable to do. So putting some work into it. But I still do. Like, I haven't seen a review very recently, but I still have a feeling that if the proposal does not win, come to the top in a very competitive group, and the competition, as you know, is very stiff. If it doesn't come to the top on intellectual merit, even a really cool broader impact section, I mean, I think it's really wonderful, actually, is probably not going to be enough to overcome that. Now, I, of course, could be wrong, but this is sort of my impression. And I would guess that other people might feel the same. That is, they want to do something really good in BI. They want it to help their proposal. They're serious about it, but they really have to win on IM. That's my feeling about it. And of course, I could be wrong.
Yeah, the review that was done in, was it 2011, Steve, the one that you read through, still highlighted the importance of that reviewer, that writers or proposals still felt that to be the case. That when that 2011 review was done, I guess that's the right year. That's how most of us felt who were submitters. But there was a change happening within the agency that as reported, there was a greater emphasis, or an increased emphasis, perhaps not greater, but increased emphasis on broader impacts, or recognizing that it's important enough to be noted in the review process, which is, I think, where we are today. We still feel like that to be the case, but those who submit are not all of the same mind, and I felt, even in my time that I was applying years back, I felt the same way. I spent way more time. But I
didn't get much feedback comments, on
the
broader impact part, which I was kind of proud of. I thought,
it's a good
the comments were about the science and the IM.
Yeah, I think I had comments back from mine. Many of the NSF staff has been grant writers before they became NSF staff. I think that to be still the case, Candace, in your situation as well. Have you seen and felt change? Those of you in the staff, have you felt change in your role as a submitter over the history of the last 20 years at NSF, or 10 years? Scott just reminded me that, in fact, he's a NASA awardee rather than an NSF awardee. So do you have some comments, Scott, that you'd like to add about this context? And then I'd like to hear from others of the NSF team as well.
I can just bring in from my NASA experience, and that's going back pre-COVID, about 3 years ago. They're just getting back into the mission proposal thing right now with MedX, I think. But it was not very crisp, let's put it that way. I think everyone was kind of looking at each other, both on the proposing and the reviewing side. Other than that, it just defaults into the kind of the classic small business, disadvantaged business, woman-owned business categories. And that was about it, without really economic or national security discussions, anything like that. So.
Thank you. Alicia?
I think what has changed over the past 10 to 20 years is people's familiarity with broader impacts. And I recognize that on this, as part of this commission and in board meetings, that you all probably hear from individuals who aren't as familiar with broader impacts. But now there's an entire professional society that is dedicated to broader impacts. And that was stood up roughly around 2014. So I think that there is greater familiarity across a wider distribution of individuals about what is broader impacts. And when we think about the most basic interpretation of our 2 review criteria, intellectual merit is about the potential to generate new knowledge, and broader impacts is the benefit to society. In the most basic ways, those 2 items are understood by most people who apply to NSF. And if they aren't understood, people learn them as part of the process of applying to NSF. If they are at a well-resourced institution, they likely have staff who can help them interpret those review criteria. And I think that over the past 20 years, the increase in staff to help interpret the very complex processes of NSF, plus all the other federal agencies and private foundations and companies that have resources to provide to investigators. So I think that resourcing has grown, but it's not grown equitably, so that there are many institutions that don't have those translators available, and that investigators have to learn this on their own, which is probably the case that many investigators have learned this kind of information on their own, and they've tried to figure it out on their own. If they've become a reviewer, they got experience being a reviewer, and maybe that helped them be a better proposer to NSF. And I think this works the same at all federal agencies. But generally speaking, the thing that is different from the last task force report is how many more ideas there are, more perspectives and more practices there are around the broader impacts criterion. And since we kind of think of that as a general benefits to society, that can go in all sorts of different ways. It's not really disciplinary specific. Intellectual merit usually is very disciplinary specific, unless you're doing multidisciplinary types of work, and then you got to work it out across multiple reviewers about what is intellectual merit in an interdisciplinary space. So I think we have a lot more to work with now compared to 10 or 20 years ago.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alicia. I think you're right. In my own university, the newsletters now in the last couple of years have highlighted the broader impacts components of grants. It's really interesting to get these newsletters from the university wide. That's not just the medical school that's reaching out to communities. It's the arts and sciences that is as well, and much of this comes from NSF support. So I've seen a change in my institution, but again, it's a top 20 institution. So your comments about under-resourced institutions is an important one to remember also. And I'm wondering if we could do a better job making sure, or I'm sure NSF has reached out to VPs for research and departments and have highlighted those kind of things. I don't mean to put any other load on the NSF, but if there is anything that could be done in that regard, Alicia, then maybe it's worth talking about. I mean, are we paying enough attention to it as an agency to ensure that we address that part? Sorry, go ahead, please.
As you all know, because we have briefed the board, NSF has an entire program granted, Growing Research Access for Nationally Transformative Equity and Diversity, to address just those issues.
Right. Any other comments on that question of how you felt as a review? Julia, please.
Okay, this may be from left field, and if it's not appropriate for this conversation, I think maybe it belongs somewhere else in a parking lot. And that is in the first document that was in the diligence book. It was the one from the Academy of Public Administrators. The point that there is a need for quantitative measures and performance indicators to track the objectives of the new merit review criteria. And I think it would be very useful for this group at some point to discuss what is being done in that and what they are showing?
I take your point. I've struggled with this part myself because I figured it would come up in this discussion, and how you do criteria rating for broader impacts. It's pretty easy in one side and not in the other, because evaluating each of those on a case by case basis by the staff in the NSF may or may not have the capability to do it. I'd love to hear from Alicia about how do you see the reviewers, the program managers in the NSF in terms of their annual reviews of performance of these grants, and as they read the progress reports, are they free? Do they feel free to make strong recommendations around broader impacts or around IM for that matter? And how much time can be spent on each annual report of the thousands of grants that are given? It just gets to the criteria question. It's just asked.
So could you clarify what you mean by time spent on annual reports? You mean reviewing annual reports?
Yes, reviewing annual reports and evaluating whether or not programs or grant awardees, it's a team or individual, have met goals in broader impacts in year 1, year 2, year 3, compared to how you rank progress in intellectual merit.
Well, I can't speak for every program officer, and Candace probably has the most direct experience here that she might be able to speak to. But program officers absolutely take the annual reports and final reports seriously. They give comments back to PIs. It might be varied in how they do it, whether it's written feedback versus conversation versus, when they discuss the evolution of someone's research program. And certainly the types of awards we provide are very different. So we have individual investigator awards versus, I'll go on the other end of the spectrum, center grants, center awards. And so there's going to be a lot of difference in how those award reports get treated based on, I'll just make a suggestion here, that complexity is probably a factor that weighs in there.
Yeah, I can't imagine any other way than that it would be really a complex analysis. And so when Julia asked that question, I get to this point of do you give them numerical scores, and if yes, for what? Or do you say yes, they've made substantial progress or not? Julia, can you follow?
If I could just read a little bit from this report. I mean, I think it feels like we are really talking about mush unless we can get a little more specific here. And so this report, this conclusion, basically, it would be extremely useful for NSF to institute long-term tracking of the effects of its research projects, measuring effects at least 10 years out. The most recent COV report strongly reinforced this need for long-term project tracking and better collection of data relative to the NSF objectives in instituting the new merit review criteria. Basically, it's a matter of understanding in a quantitative way the impact of having these criteria. Intellectual merit feels relatively straightforward, certainly compared to broader impacts. But if you can't measure the impact, boy, that's a problem.
Comments by anyone? Wanda, you were there for a number of years. How do you take these these views with regard to measurement long term?
I was honestly afraid you were going to call on me, Roger.
Well, yeah, for a reason, I guess. This
is a tough one, and actually, as Julia was making this extremely important point, I tried to think of not a counterexample. I tried to think of ways that any other agencies address this, i.e. in assessing and measuring the long-term impact of whatever criteria they use, particularly as it pertains to research. fundamental research, curiosity-driven research, plus use-inspired research. I don't know, and perhaps someone who's been at NSF a long time as well may be familiar with what the foundation's response to that Napa report was, to give us some insight. I don't want to conjecture and just speculate. If we could, I recommend that we search the records to see if NSF has responded to that inquiry formally or informally, or if some of our NSF colleagues know. On the talent production side of things, I know NSF appropriately and unabashedly always makes claims about the GRF recipients who have then gone on to become Nobel Prize winners, showing a kind of impact of that early investment in talent and how it contributes to, not necessarily causes, but contributes to world-class impact in the scientific domain.
Thanks. There is, I mean, are there any other responses from the NSF, Candace or Alicia or others that are in this mix?
So Roger, I would just say I'm trying to track this really rich conversation and relate it back to sort of, it feels that we've moved on a little bit from discussion of how broader impacts and intellectual merit are considered. I don't want to use the word holistically. I know that's what we've been saying, but, you know, looking at the PAPP guidance, it's a somewhat different phrase, which is given full consideration. You know, each criterion is necessary, neither in itself is sufficient, and full consideration is not necessarily equal consideration, as the points that Steve made in the beginning, you know, really underscored. And it feels in my mind that we've moved on a bit to say the promise of the proposal at the time of submission with respect to generating knowledge and benefits to society, and then how that is tracked or assessed post-award. I just want to make sure that I'm tracking correctly where the conversation has gone.
Yeah, I certainly hope that's the case, that we're looking for follow on from the original, which would be, but I think it's the annual, but that's why I asked the question about the annual review. There's enough flexibility, always a flexibility in IM. I assume there is a flexibility in BI as well. That's still correct?
All right, flexibility?
Flexibility in change of direction. If something doesn't work in IM, we allow flexibility to move the technology to another direction, and same with BI, I would assume.
Understand why something time of proposal that made a lot of sense for a variety of reasons might not implemented
exactly at the end, right? Yeah, I assume that's the case. There's this other question about whether or not the program officer has the flexibility in his or her mandate to manage a portfolio of expectations, and that as a whole, a program will be balanced in BI and IM impacts, and then he or she is measured or then quantifies whether or not as a program they are successful. So how do we feel about program management versus individual grants management in broader impact and as a criterion for what we expect NSF to do? I guess this is for the members of the NSB. Scott and Steve. Steve, you had a comment?
Well, the conversation sort of went, you took the conversation in a different direction. So I'll let somebody answer the question.
Okay, yes, thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, Matt and Scott and whom else? Julia. How do you feel about a program manager balancing this all out rather than individual?
I find myself going back to some of Julia's points in that we're bound to start tracking this in some level of detail. So we need a bit of definition out there. On the one hand, I agree that it's going to be difficult on a case-by-case basis to be real, explicit on the criteria. And that I do think we need to have the program managers looking across a portfolio. We need to get a bit more specific because we're required to by the legislation. We can't be here a year or two from now and saying, yes, we're still doing this holistic review, which is fine, and that's how we're reporting on it, because I don't think that's what the expectation is.
Julia?
Yeah. So first of all, my comments earlier, I'm quite happy to have those put off into a parking lot. I just think those must be dealt with before the commission finishes its work. But in terms of the whole portfolio management, I don't know how that can be done at a proposal by proposal level. I mean, the broader impacts covers a really wide waterfront, and it is unrealistic, especially in the individual PI grants, to expect very much of that waterfront to be covered in any given proposal or project. And so I think it has to be up to the program manager or some group to look at the entire suite of proposals to ascertain that, not every single one in terms of broader impacts is looking at, I don't know, K-3 STEM education. And nobody's paying any attention to the other aspects that go into broader impacts. That would probably not be a good portfolio any more than having all of the proposals in physics be focused on, say, condensed matter physics.
Right. Thank you. Yep. I think there's agreement there as well. Well stated. Steve, we've got about 1 or 2 minutes before I turn this to Candace to talk about whether or not there are policy implications that the NSB and others should recommend.
Sure.
For
I just wanted to, Alicia talked about the evolution of broader impacts as an appreciated consideration. Has our reporting, both on an interim basis and at the end of a program, evolved so that there's a holistic reporting of successes and failures on the BI front as robustly as on the IM front?
Is that a question for Alicia?
Yes.
Well, so there's a lot of flexibility in the reporting tool that's made available through research.gov. And I provided an example in SharePoint about what that looks like, so that because you can go into research.gov and see what the template looks like. So there's a lot of flexibility. People can take it in all sorts of different directions.
Do program managers sort of hold people accountable with regard to BI goals in the same way that they do IM goals?
Well, sure. I mean, again, can't speak for all program
Can't
officers.
speak for everybody. Yep.
So let's just say, for example, I have a project that I've received funds for, and I have very exciting broader impacts that have taken off faster than the research program work. Maybe I'm still collecting data, but I was able to, really build up some very interesting outreach with the community or engage parents in helping kids connect with STEM or something like that. I might put in one of my annual reports a lot more information about broader impacts than I might in the second year. That doesn't mean that the broader impacts weren't still going great and fantastic the second year. It might just be I took more space there. So again, the reporting function allows for that kind of thing. I think I'm sort of curious as to what you're looking for. Are you thinking that there's not enough structure? Are you thinking that there needs to be more instruction? I'd like more information.
It's more, yeah, we're in an information gathering. You talked about how BI had evolved since 2014 and whatever, and I wondered if our reporting requirements evolved with it.
I think the requirements are very similar, but the flexibility, and again, I haven't looked at broader impacts reporting material that, you know, would be a culling of who reports what, but the flexibility to allow for that, which is really what we need to be providing, is there.
Great,
So
thank you.
we're sort of getting into the policy side of this, and that's good. That's good transition. But Sarah Kay, you had a comment before I turn it over to Candace.
Yeah, just one comment I was going to make. Again, really rich conversation, and I hope I'm tracking it all correctly, and I hope my NSF colleagues will weigh in if I get this wrong. But you know, in my mind, I'm not currently a program director, used to be. When an award is made through a grant mechanism, it's not like a contract, right? So at the time of proposal, a set of knowledge generating activities and or benefits to society, right? They're being proposed. And in part of the post-award management process through the template in our PPR, which is, as Alicia says, it's very broad, it's very flexible. It allows people to provide, you know, rich and detailed narrative descriptions of what's going on, but it's different than a contract where one says, you know, I've signed up to do X, and if X doesn't obtain, there's some sort of remedial action. I feel, if I'm tracking the board's conversation correctly, that one of the questions is the merit review criteria that are used to judge the promise of an award or the promise of a proposal at the time of submission, then ideally there is this closing the loop to say, if these are the criteria we use to judge promise, is there evidence that those criteria are leading to the promises that we hoped would obtain? And that's kind of the circling back to the loop. But I think the emphasis here is really looking at the time of proposal. How are the criteria being used, and how are they being considered? Again, jointly, neither alone is sufficient. Both need to be considered to make reasonable judgments about the promise of a proposal. So I just want to make sure I'm tracking all of this.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. That's good. And Alicia put a comment in the chat box as well that's worth everyone reminder to everyone. I think a lot of us are looking forward to the product of the reviewing that's going on, but into the stakeholders group that we're going to be talking about it, I guess, in the December meeting. Because I think I'd like to know also, Steve, whether or not this has changed, whether or not there is a change in the community, both the applicant community and the university community and the NSF that would come out in this bigger project that we're contracting out. Candace, do you want to handle the policy making? Thank you all very much for this introductory sort of discussion. Now the question is, do we have recommendations for policy change? Candace?
Sure. Thank you, Roger. And yes, thanks everyone. I agree. This is a super rich discussion, and I think that Julia's comments and question could easily be fodder for an entire session of its own, at least one. So, but what we'd like to focus on in the second part of the conversation here is whether clarification of policy is required, and Steve, in his introductory remarks, quoted out of the proposal and award preparation guide, the PAPG, that both criteria are to be given full consideration during the review and decision-making processes. Neither by itself is sufficient. And so moving beyond that, we have that is the key to the policy, the intellectual merit and the broader impacts, but we also have other elements of policy that are important in that fall beneath that or fall within that framework. And those are the merit review elements and principles. And so thinking not only holistically about intellectual merit and broader impacts, but also about all of the policy guidance that is currently provided. Are the criteria, the elements, and principles together sufficient to guide a holistic approach to using the intellectual merit and broader impacts criteria?
Sorry, Candace, could you ask that one more time?
Yeah, sure. The question is, how do the merit review elements, currently there are 5 elements that fall, that describe each one of the 2 main criteria. Are those sufficient and appropriate to guide a holistic review? And you may recall that those elements are currently mostly the same for both IM and BI. One question is, should they be? Alicia has a comment.
So you asked this not really as a discussion question, you asked it as yes or no. So I'm going to answer it yes. I think they are sufficient. And I would then maybe ask if we could identify specific elements where if people feel it's not sufficient.
Or could be enhanced.
I was pleased with the change that happened between 97 and when the second report, when the subsequent reports have come out. And it's hard for me to, since I don't write them anymore, to know whether or not I need more guidance. I'd love to hear from younger people. I mean, I think the value of younger people who are the new assistant and associate professors at institutions. Do they understand them as well as they need to? And you may well know that answer already, Alicia. It'd just be informative for us to know. And other than the challenge of having different institutions being prepared enough for answering the questions or helping an investigator write an award application or a grant application. I'd love to know if they, I mean, Matt's written lots of them. I wrote a lot of them. Are the young people equally as informed after failing because they haven't failed yet?
That's a very good question. I honestly do not know.
Your younger colleagues at the institution.
You have to sit around with coffee with a lot of people to really talk about their most recent NSF proposal, and I haven't done it enough. It would be very interesting to do so. It's a good question.
I'd love to hear from the NSF. I mean, what if you take this from an informative review? I mean, just some information, Candace. When younger first investigators apply, it's not usual that a first application wins, and it's not always it's not intellectual merit. And in some regard, it's often, I think, BI, or I would have thought it was often in BI. Is that incorrect or correct?
I think that the new investigators tend to be very diligent in reading the policy, and one of the things to explore in this discussion is, especially for those things, is that policy guidance as clear as those people who are coming to, who are preparing, and maybe they're new investigators, or maybe they're more, mid or late career investigators who just don't have the experience applying to NSF. And, we're really trying to broaden engagement here. So is the policy for those people clear and instructive enough to give them the best chance at success?
Yeah, and that's the question. That should be evidentiary, right? It should be, the review of this initial investigator was indicated this or that. Have we looked at those those refusals to know whether or not it's a BI problem or a science problem or a investigational question?
Alicia.
So I don't want to stray far from the policy side, but I think we're sort of looking at either anecdotes that we're familiar with or sort of general thoughts without the evidence again behind it to suggest that people are not getting funded because of intellectual merit or broader impacts. There are lots of reasons why people don't get funded, and we only have a certain amount of money that we're able to provide based on our budget. So there are going to be a lot of people who don't get funded because we don't have the resources. but the intellectual merit and broader impacts as the guiding light as to how to organize your proposal, how to write and speak to specific things, to be very clear. Now one thing that's changed, probably, Roger, in that time frame we were talking about before, 10 to 20 years, is the specification that broader impacts and intellectual merit have to be clearly written in the summary and the project description. You have to have section headings for those, or you get returned without review. So those are very clear ways in which PIs have the opportunity to say, from my perspective around my idea that I am giving to you all to share, to evaluate, and so on, this is what I think the intellectual merit and the broader impacts are. Now, if you disagree, then that's part of the evaluation part.
Yeah. No,
But I do
I
think
would-
that there are lots of reasons why people don't get funded.
Well, I don't mean to, what I was interested in have is knowing whether or not we've tracked enough of those to know if there's a failure of the reviewer, of the reader, or a failure, of the writer or of the reader. And that's what I was asking. I was really pleased to see the change as I read the document of having both of those pulled out and noted in the summary. So I like that change too, even though I found that a good change.
Wanda.
I was very struck by Roger's question about the utilization by younger awardees or younger proposers in general. And it took me, using Alicia's word, it reminded me anecdotally of what I believe we've seen over the years among career awardees and PCASE awardees, who tend, I believe, to be on the younger scholar side by design. And I remember routinely, many of them approached broader impacts very integrally to their entire project, not just IM, but we saw a great integration of IM and BI, frequently on the education side, but not exclusively on the education side. And I don't know whether we have any data available, whether it's been analyzed or not, but whether we have any data available to be able to take a look at that in enough time to inform our consideration of our recommendations and suggestions. And another thought, perhaps this is something towards implementation side in the future, is that given the richness of data contained in the Merit Review Digest, and I believe the digest routinely breaks down awardees by age or stage, as well as a number of other indicators. And I wonder whether we currently have any insights into the use of the two criteria, IM vis-a-vis BI, within those data, or is this something that we think useful enough to incorporate in future versions of the digest?
So
Thank
Wanda,
you.
I'm wondering if you could just clarify what your question is. You referenced the career program specifically. What
Yes.
what you'd like to see from that?
Because my recollection is that routinely, certainly the awardees, and I suspect because of the nature of the application process, there's greater emphasis on the use and utilization of both of the criteria, intellectual merit and broader impacts. And my impression is that there is a hefty amount among this specialized pool of early career talent to definitely make use of broader impacts. Do we know whether we see that also at the level of the elements and the principles? Does that help, Sarah Kay?
I think, yeah. Yeah, it would be interesting to look at that,
Oh, that's Andy, I'm
and to
sorry.
parse it out, because another question that we've talked about in the past is review or solicitation specific criteria. And so for the career solicitation, there are lots of solicitation specific criteria that are part of, they are within the broader impacts, many of them focused on education by design of that program. So because they are a requirement, specific requirement for that program, they're a bit different by design than a more open or core program that doesn't have solicitations, but those specific solicitation specific criteria.
Is that across directorates, across scientific domains?
For career, there is a single solicitation.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Julia had her hand up. Julia, did you have a comment?
Well, I mean, just first, a very minor one, which is I would not be surprised at all if the younger principal investigators get this in a way that the more mature investigators don't, because, you are shaped by the environment you grow up in, and they've grown up with this expectation. So that's just a comment. The thing that, this gets back to my earlier question. Are there any data about the level to which the funding decisions are influenced by the kind of degree to which broader impacts are incorporated? I realize if they're not there at all, then it's dead on arrival. But if they are superficially included versus integrally included, does that make a quantifiable difference in terms of the funding success? Something to tell us whether or not these are making much difference.
Alicia, did you have anything to know of anything that might address Julia's question?
Well, I think I know that we've done, I think we'll have to get back to the commission with respect to whether there are, I would say, more informal studies and looking at BI, because that's again a heavy narrative examination. But we'd have to define what is meant by integrated versus sort of tangential or whatever. And then again, there's a lot of different aspects to projects and what's being proposed and so on. And we don't really have a depth to the BI criteria that says this broader impacts activity is more valuable than this other broader impacts activity. The broader impacts activities should be aligned with the project being proposed. So what I love, I'll put this statement out here. What I love about what we've got in the current criteria and the way it's described is a lot of flexibility. And that flexibility allows junior faculty to come in and experience NSF and hopefully become successful, but it also allows later career faculty to flourish and have their work supported. It allows a lot of innovative ideas to come forward. It allows for this diversity that we're really trying to amplify across the entire research community. And to have too much over specification, I'm not saying we can't look at things and review data and take some examinations, but that flexibility has really allowed for a lot of people to access NSF. And I feel like going back to the yes, is it sufficient? Yes, it's sufficient in the sense of that flexibility really helps us and helps the community.
Yeah, I think we recognize the importance of the flexibility, Alicia. I mean, as somebody who's, those of us who know the agency, the issue that Julia has, and I think it'll come back again and again, is how you measure it. The impacts that the BI has had over a longer term. And I appreciate we need to have a full discussion of this, but I'm not sure if we're prepared to have that yet.
Yeah. And also, measuring over a long period of time, reporting is only a part of that, because reporting lasts as long as a project lasts, but the impact of a project can last far, far longer.
Far beyond.
So how do you mine the information about ongoing impacts of NSF funding? And it's something that we're always striving for, I think, within the agency. So just going back in the last couple of minutes to questions of policy clarification. Do any of you see any gaps in the current policy guidance that you think may hinder either PIs proposing to NSF or reviewers reviewing to NSF from fully from addressing both of the criteria?
Question to all of us on the board, is there, and others.
And Alicia.
So I'll be very specific. The second element, which reads, to what extent do proposed activities, doesn't say if it's the scientific activities or the broader impacts, suggest and explore creative, original, or potentially transformative concepts? And we have talked in this committee before, and I know that this is of interest to many investigators as well, that sometimes broader impacts aren't original, or they're not novel, maybe they're not seen as transformative. Maybe this is a broader impact activity that someone has done throughout their entire career, and it's very successful, and they evaluate it, and they have great impact on whatever part of society they're trying to influence. And so suggesting that things have to be novel or original is, from a broader impacts perspective, somewhat problematic. And so to the extent that clarity in the language could allow for more flexibility, that would be great.
I think we've talked about this in previous meetings. I would agree with you, Alicia. If there's a way to do that, I don't think we have to have novelty in the BI to be important.
Yes.
We can't assess novelty in a geographical region or a specific area. It might be living in one area might learn from another set of studies.
Yes.
And I hope that we agreed. I hope that's, at least my sense is that that's an important component.
Agreed. Yes. Judicious application.
Yes. Right.
Okay, let's let that be the last word. Thank you all for a very productive conversation, especially to you, Candace and Roger. And thank you all for commenting on our draft data work plan. Our contractor is making revisions based on your feedback. And at our next meeting on October 8th, we will review the revised work plan.
October 8th or?
October 8th. I'm sorry, November 8th. Sorry about that.
Okay.
This will be your opportunity to comment on data collection questions that will be used in surveys, focus groups, and interviews with our various stakeholders. So please come prepared to participate. We also look forward to updating you on our commission timeline as we work toward delivering preliminary recommendations and suggestions to the board in May. In the meantime, please review the minutes from last month's MRX meeting and submit your response by Monday. For those watching on YouTube, we welcome your general suggestions and inquiries. Please contact us at meritreviewcommission@nsf.gov. And to learn more about activities regarding this reexamination, visit www.nsf.gov/NSB. Thank you again for a productive meeting. This concludes our business for today, and the meeting is adjourned at 1 p.m.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all
Thanks,
very much.